LSTC celebration of Women's History Month. My name is Marvis Hardy. I'm the program coordinator for Perot Center for Intersectionality Studies. This two-day event was made possible by a generous grant from our LSTC alum, Reverend Margie Olson. You'll hear more about her later as we share some exciting news at the end of today's discussion. This year, LSTC celebrates the work of women doing ministry. We honor the voices of those women who have been unheard and unacknowledged. Hence, the theme for this year's celebration is Muted Theologians. On yesterday, we shared the voices of three distinguished women sharing the theologies of Native and Latina women. Today, we will hear a feminist theologian discussing Lutheran feminist theology and abortion politics. We begin with our moderator, LSTC's own Dr. Candace Kohli, Assistant Professor of Lutheran Systematic Theology and Global Lutheranism. She will introduce our speaker and moderate questions following the speaker presentation. Please put your questions in the chat, and she'll respond to them. And so I turn it over to Dr. Kohli. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvis. Welcome, everyone. And we want to give Dr. Riswold a special welcome today. I'm going to read her bio and then turn it over. And as you have questions, send them in the chat. I will keep track. And then when Dr. Riswold is done with her presentation, we will do a Q&A. So welcome, Dr. Riswold. Dr. Carlyn Riswold is currently Professor of Religion and the McCoy Family Distinguished Chair in Lutheran Heritage and Mission at Wartburg College in Iowa. Dr. Riswold joined the Wartburg College faculty in 2018 after teaching religion and gender and women's studies at Illinois College for 16 years. Prior to that, she was a postdoctoral teaching fellow in the Lilly Fellows Program at Valparaiso University. As both a champion and a product of Lutheran higher education, she earned her BA from Augustana College. Some of our constituents on the call here today, I believe, joined that. An MA from the Claremont School of Theology in Claremont, California, and she earned her THM and PhD at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. In addition to her years of teaching experience, Dr. Riswold is an accomplished scholar in Lutheran and feminist theologies as the author of 3 books, including Feminism and Christianity, Questions and Answers in the Third Wave, published in 2009, and 2 reformers, Martin Luther and Mary Daly, as political theologians, published in 2007. In addition, she has authored multiple chapters, articles, and essays in various publications. Dr. Riswold has distinguished herself as a scholar in vocation and higher education, an avid writer. She writes regularly for online publications, as well as local and regional newspapers on topics at the intersection of religion, politics, social justice, and pop culture. A warm welcome, Dr. Riswold. We are so happy to have you join us today.
Thank you, Candace, very much for that introduction. Good to see some of your faces, some of your pictures, some of your names. It's a delight to be here today. So thank you, Candace, for the introduction and then for moderating and managing questions later. Thanks to Marvis for the communication, the invitation, Dr. Linda Thomas for bringing my name into the mix when you were planning this event, and to Sam for running technology and doing all the behind the scenes things that we can't have marvelous events like this without. I also want to give thanks to Pete and Cheryl Perot for being some of the ancestors who accompanied me in this work. Pete was my doctoral committee chair at LSTC in the late 90s, and I was very grateful for his steady presence and his inspiring work. And Cheryl, for many years, was a colleague in the Lutheran Women in Theological and Religious Studies group. So that their name is now affixed to LSTC Center for Intersectionality is a delight. And it's really an honor for me to be kind of present at one of your events. And in the interest of kind of connecting across the generations, I mentioned one of my former Wartburg College students, at least one is here. who is a current LSTC student. So hello, Madeline. She's hiding behind her picture right now. So it's delightful. And Nathaniel's too. Hi, Nathaniel. So it's really fun for me to sort of sit at the intersection of generations, actually. And what a delight that is. So here's where my plan is for us today. I am going to, let's see, are you all seeing the screen? Let me make sure we're working. Awesome. So I'm going to talk about Lutheran feminist theology with an intersectionality framework today, and then I'm going to quite quickly get into some practical applications and what difference it's making in the world, or what difference it can make in the world today. One slight addition to the bio that Candace read, my fourth book was just published here in August of 2025. You see it up there on the screen, and so some of what I'm going to do today will kind of point in that direction and encourage some engagement with Lutheran social teaching. Because when we're talking about feminist theology today, it is nothing if not practical and relevant to the issues that are in front of us today. My general plan for there we go. The time that we have together here today, there's far too much. So I may jump over things too quickly. I'm going to leave time for question and engagement and go to whichever topics are most of interest to the fine people gathered here. So I'm going to say a few things initially about Lutheran feminist theology at the outset with, as I noted, the intersectionality framework and some key concepts there that in my work and in my mind at least bring the two into conversation. I'm going to shift then to this practical application. I think that one characteristic both of being Lutheran and being feminist is engaging in the world around us today and doing difficult things. Abortion politics is one of those things today that is in front of us, ahead of us, and surrounding us. Since this is a Women's History Month event, I'm going to have a little nod to history, talking about how we got here, the ELCA social statement on abortion having been approved back in 1991. And so just a snapshot or a reminder for those of us who were alive in 1991, what that looked like. And then finally, what shall we do? And then open it up for some conversations and questions. I just offer this briefly, which I often do when I'm talking about some of this work, because conversations and engagement around the abortion social statement and this issue generally are going to be different based on the nature of the group gathered. So whether this is for now in our time together, or whether you are inspired to sort of take some of this work forward in your own ministry and teaching context. Guidance for conversations like this, as many of you know, is speak truthfully, speak only for yourself, listen patiently, assume the best of one another, and do not demand that participants share things they don't want to, reminding all of us that our stories are sacred and they are our own stories to tell. Okay, so first of all, some framing, some theory, some theology. Here I am drawing a little bit on some work that was published about 5 years ago in the online journal Religions, a piece that I wrote called Lutheran Feminist Intersectional Theology. So if you're really interested into the sort of theory and framing and the kind of deeper academic work around this, I would direct you to that piece. I'm going to highlight a couple of things though, because what I find compelling is that to do feminist theology in 2025 looks different than it did when I started doing this work in the late 90s, when I finished my PhD in the year 2000. And as intersectionality has really become a defining characteristic that I think if you're not doing theology with an intersectionality framework, you're really missing the point. The concepts that I'm going to draw on here actually from most explicitly spelled out in the work of Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bilge in this book, Intersectionality. It's again a kind of a theoretical framing piece. They highlight 6 characteristics of intersectionality that I've kind of grouped into 4 to keep it a little more simple for our engagement here today, that I think are really important for keeping key things in mind. So let me give you some examples. So 2 of the core concepts in intersectionality that they highlight are social inequality and social context. And what that means, these are, not phrases that are new to folks here, I am entirely sure. But in this context, they talk about the way that social context is simply always analyzed, named, and engaged. Social inequality, of course, is the thing that is the result of the intersecting aspects of our identities, and specifically our relationships to systems of power and oppression. For each of these, I want to kind of name explicitly how I connect this up both to Luther and Lutheran theology, but also to feminist theology. So these two, for me, Luther's priesthood of all believers is one way that work and lives that are otherwise undervalued in church and in society are lifted up, named as sacred and holy. To me, this is also where the feminist attention to inequity throughout social life, the personal is political, is very much kind of fits under this commitment. Second category I want to name is simply the dynamics of power. Intersectionality, of course, is centered around naming where and by virtue of what does a person have access to power, and where and by virtue of what is a person denied access to power. Okay, and so power is made visible by intersectionality. That's a way that Collins and Vivian May is also a scholar who I'm drawing on here, talk about power being made visible. We need to name where it is and is not. Again, for Lutheran theology, attention to social power and ecclesial power and imbalances therein are things that we must attend to. Similarly, feminism and intersectionality, as I said, make power visible. The next category here, again, I've grouped two of the concepts together because I think all of these go together, but these very much go together. Relationality and complexity. So here, relationality being defined as these sort of simultaneous, coexistent truths, as well as identities, right? So that I am white, at the same time I'm a woman, I can't be one without being the other. The complexity piece and intersectionality is a theme, and complexity is kind of shows up in all of these categories, but it's also a tool that we use to analyze it. Again, in Luther and Lutheranism, I see that there's an anthropology baked into Luther's work that is multi-relational, right? That is, we are related to God, to each other, to ourselves, and to the world, all at the same time, okay? Multi-relational, and is paradoxical, right? So that theme of paradox, the both ands that I really think you couldn't be Lutheran without understanding sort of the both ands, the paradoxical themes shows up there. And intersectional feminism is intentional about holding complex identities and relationships together in creative tension. Last category I want to name is social justice. So social justice and intersectionality, of course, is viewed as a goal, a telos, if you will. The theory and method are moving toward this. It criticizes the status quo. It is biased. It is not pretending to be neutral. Here again, I see this showing up in Luther's work, in Lutheran theology. There's a bias toward right relations and a bias toward care for all, attention to the neighbor. Again, in a feminist note, right? Some of these I feel like we're singing similar notes in different keys, right? Feminist commitments to justice. It is a bias for justice. Feminism is not neutral. So those are kind of the four categories I want to lift up as theoretical and theological that to me are essential in being Lutheran and being feminist. I want to shift to some of the concrete applications to what difference does this make in the world. Really over the last, I would say definitely over the last 10, maybe 15 years, I've been much more intentional about doing writing and speaking theologically in ways that are practical, that are accessible to ordinary folks. I think it's probably a lifetime of working with 20-year-olds will do that to you. You have to be able to explain complicated things in a way that makes sense in the world today. But I think those are also reflective of commitments baked into Lutheranism and into feminism. Just a brief note, most of you don't need to be acquainted with the fact that the ELCA has social statements. It's good to be reminded, of course, of them. This is one way that the church shows up in the world. I think it's a really powerful way that the church shows up in the world, and an often underutilized way that the church shows up in the world. Not to say that the social statements are perfect, but they are absolutely resources on which all of us can draw for so many issues. You see on the screen here the list of the social statements that the ELCA has approved in its short life. The abortion statement was one of the first ones at the first churchwide assembly in 1991. Because of that, so Augsburg Fortress has, with the publication of my book and then another one in August, and now I think there's maybe one more, there's others coming. They are intentionally launching this series for the sake of the world, to have these kind of in-depth re-engagements with each of the social statements. What do they mean today, right? And so engaging one that was written in 1991 around this particular topic at this particular time was a fascinating challenge and opportunity. So I want to share a little bit of that with you. As I do that, I want you to pay attention, and I'll be interested to where you see these notes resonating. Where do you hear social context? Where do you hear social inequality? Where do you hear attention to power? I'm going to name some of this for myself, but I want you to pay attention to this. Where do you see attention to relationality, to complexity? And where do you see a bias for justice? Okay, so those are kind of the notes to listen for. The abortion social statement, I don't know the last time any of you read it, is a fascinating document for lots of reasons. One of which is that it's very short, it's only 12 pages long. And if you flip all the way to the end, scroll, flip, whatever you do, however you're reading it, you find this really concise list. It's a bullet point list at the very end of the social statement. When I started working on this project, it was 2023. Dobbs had been decided by that point. And I looked at this list and I thought, well, except for the first one, all of those things are happening right now. All of them. And I want you to look at the statement. Because of our conviction, this is a quote from the social statement, that both the life of the woman and the life in her womb must be respected by law, this church opposes. This church opposes. And there's a list of 7 things. Okay. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. When I have longer discussions, I'm happy to go back to any of this. When I have longer discussions with, I've done many talks on this now with church groups, community groups, campus groups, workshops, conferences. I spent a lot of time on, I'm going to go through these really quickly here with you. Again, happy to go back to any, but that was just sort of like a fascinating place to start this work, is to realize that what this church was opposing in 1991, except for the first one, is now happening everywhere and happening a lot. Okay, so I just have, there's some examples here. There's longer discussion in the book, and I'm happy to go back to any of this. Again, as I said, the first one, we're light years away from a total, the church opposes a total lack of regulation of abortion. Okay, that is so not the conversation anyone is having anywhere right now in terms of what's really happening. Legislation to outlaw abortion, it is banned in at least 14 states. That changes by the legislative cycle. This church opposes preventing access to correct and complete information. There are things like model legislation out there. The newest version of preventing access to complete information is taking the form of shadow bans on Instagram. For example, that's one of the most recent things. This church opposes lack of access to safe and affordable abortion care services for morally justifiable abortions. There's a lot to unpack with that phrase. Let's bracket that. We can have another conversation. But regardless, lack of access shows up in a lot of different ways. Access is affected by waiting periods, counseling, lack of providers. Travel bans are now happening. That started happening in 2023. Starts with language around trafficking, starts with a focus on minors. They will and they are expanding. Travel bans meaning traveling across state lines. This is not Trump 1 era Muslims travel ban. This is preventing people in this country from traveling from Iowa to Illinois to seek care. This church opposes coerced abortions or sterilization. That's really important to include as part of this conversation, lest we think that abortion is only about white women seeking access to abortion. Abortion conversations are also about coercion, about sterilization, laws that target disabled women, poor women, and incarcerated women. This church opposes lack of access to contraception. In theory, wouldn't it be nice if the Affordable Care Act had solved for this these many years ago? It has not. The Hobby Lobby court decision was the most prominent effort of trying to protect employers' right to deny access to birth control. And there are other ways that data shows that women report not having access, still based on cost, sometimes based on information, sometimes based on education. Last thing I'll note on this reality check, this church opposes laws intending to harass those considering or seeking abortion. There's a long history of this in terms of violence against clinics and healthcare providers. There was in the 90s, there was a Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act passed by Congress. In the last decade, those laws are now being repealed. You see in 2014, there was a Massachusetts law struck down. And so we're back to all of that. So again, that was a whirlwind. Again, you see there's a lot to unpack there. But I want to go back to where I started. This church opposes these things. Okay. The other thing I want to lift up in this, and I have the word both and bolded here on purpose, because so often conversations around abortion politics feature, I don't know, I live in Iowa, I live in the Midwest, where billboards with pictures of free-floating fetuses are quite common. Think about what is literally being erased to get that picture. Think about what is literally being erased to get that picture. The woman's body. So I even just start with the actual radicality of a church, a social statement on a theology that says we respect multiple things here, right? The both and. To ignore one or the other is completely missing the point. Okay. There are other key points in the social statement. Here again, I want to just sort of note some topics. And again, invite you to see, where do we see social inequality paid attention to? Where do we see power being paid attention to? Where do we see relationality and complexity being highlighted? Again, these are just a few more direct quotations from the social statement. So you got the sense of like, here's what we oppose. Here are some other key points. Some are constructive as well. So again, that ignoring neither the value of unborn life nor the value of the woman and her other relationships. I wrote a whole article once on that phrase, the woman and her other relationships. To me, that's so rich in terms of what's actually being talked about there. Calling forth women's power to act responsibly and affirming the value of women's lives. I wish that wasn't a radical thing to say, but here we are in 2025, right? Where affirming women's value, the value of women's lives, feels radical. We're here, we're back. I don't know what to say about that, right? There's a really clear statement in the social statement where it says this church recognizes there can be sound reasons for ending a pregnancy through induced abortion. It's very direct. Here's the fun part of this, because the next question is always, well, what are those reasons, right? Social statement doesn't give us a list of reasons. The social statement says we trust women to make those decisions in consultation with their doctors, with their families, with their communities of care, right? On those communities of care, there's a clear statement in this that the folks in this conversation might be particularly interested in, that the pastoral response, regardless of decisions, the pastoral response must be assistance. I would also use the language here as the ELC does of accompaniment. What is recognized to be morally responsible in one situation is not necessarily so in another, right? So that is why the social statement, even though I said it's relatively short with 12 pages, it's also not one page, right? The ELCA's social statement on abortion isn't abortion is bad. It's also not abortion is good, right? It's a little more complicated than that. And we recognize that situations differ. That's simply what happens. Last point, on the sort of bias is that the social statement's really clear on calling the church and its members to join with others to advocate and support just laws and to work to change those which are unjust. So this is where engaging this statement from 1991, let's talk about 1991. My first challenge when I started this was the editor at Augsburg Fortress said, well, is it still relevant today? I've also, I've worked with Mary Streufert, Director of Gender Justice for Women at the ELCA for many years as well. And this was sort of a conversation like, is the abortion statement still relevant? Does it hold up? Does it speak to the day? Right, that was an initial challenge. And so go back to 1991. Some of us were there, meaning alive, right? You can see how foxy I was there in 1991. I was a junior in college. I had these shiny shoes with bows on them. They were all the rage at that point. I like curly hair, eye makeup, like that's 1991 right there. But the larger kind of cultural forces around what generation of the women's movement we were in at that point. Rebecca Walker had just in the early 90s coined the phrase the third wave. It partially in an article that she was written after the Clarence Thomas hearings where Anita Hill testified. And again, some of us remember the public. So I was vaguely politically conscious at that point, but you can't have lived through that and not have paid attention to the way that Anita Hill was treated in the press, talked about the Thomas hearings, sort of the whole debacle of that. There's a generational thing going on here, right? So in the 90s, we were the generation of women who had been raised with all these protections around Title IX and Roe and whatnot. Title IX, these are the second wave feminist kind of accomplishments from the early 70s. The Riot Girl movement, the zines, like there was a whole thing going on. 92 was actually called the Year of the Woman in American politics, because at that point, you see their lovely skirt suits there on the Capitol. The most women ever elected to Congress at that point, I think was 20 in 1992. So it was called the year of, maybe that was the Senate, the Year of the Woman. There were also other things going on. So there was I gave you all that to say there was a lot of hope. There was a lot of like, things are getting better. Things are getting more complicated and we're figuring it out. There are other things that were not getting better. I have a couple of images up here referring to some key decisions that had to do with reproductive rights. The Hyde Amendment, the Webster decision, and the Casey decision. All of these decisions, legislation in the case of the Hyde Amendment, but then the two Supreme Court decisions, Webster and Casey, slowly were chipping away and restricting access to abortion care services specifically. Things like waiting period, parental consent, various other sort of restrictions on use of federal or public money to pay for abortion. That's what the Hyde Amendment is about. So I just sort of, again, since we're talking about, let's talk about history. So this is the context out of which the social statement came. The ELCA in 1991, again, young denomination, formally officially formed, of course, in 88 as a successor to many church bodies. There were two other social statements. These were the first three that were approved in 91, the Church and Society and the Statement on the Death Penalty. And just kind of, again, some of you may recall these moments in the church. Maybe some of you were at this church-wide assembly. Issues around the sort of gender and sexuality in the church were also kind of at a particular generational moment. Ruth and Phyllis were ordained against church teaching about gay and lesbian people of faith in 1990. April Larson, of course, became the first woman to serve as bishop in the ELCA in 1992. So again, I just sort of lump all of these things together to invite you to think about how we got here, right? So that is the context out of which this social statement emerged. And you can see, again, some of the hope, some of the issues that were going on at that point. Today, let's fast forward to today. Conversations that are around abortion and all of the things related to it, we now have a much better framing that it is actually a product of the work of women of color activists, advocates, organizers, writers, theorists, poets, and so on. And the language of reproductive justice that emerged out of the sister song, the Women of Color Reproductive Justice Coalition Collective. I'm not getting all of the words in the right order. but offer up this framework that I think is more helpful for us to use today. So this is language, right, that was not available. This framing wasn't quite until after 1991. This language wasn't available, doesn't show up in the ELCA social statement. However, I absolutely think that it is consistent. The social statement is consistent with what we see here. The definition of reproductive justice is on the screen in front of you. It is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy. And there are three things: to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. Okay. To live into that, you can see how clearly abortion and reproductive rights is a part of this. But you know what? So is criminal justice. So is wage inequality. So is climate care. So is racism. So is homophobia. So is transsexism. All of these other things are also under this sort of umbrella of reproductive justice today. We have this language, we have this framing now. And I think that's really important for a lot of reasons. One of them is that sometimes folks I don't like to talk about abortion in public, right? Clearly, I don't have that problem, right? But they don't like to talk about it, and but they don't quite know, but they want to be involved, but they're not quite sure. It's like, okay, so it's hard for you to say the word. I've had friends come up to me and say, "Oh, your new book." I'm like, "Oh, what?" It's like, abortion. Right? I'm like, it's okay. We can say the word in public, and we'd probably be better off if more folks did say the words in public. But if that's hard for you to talk about or to know how to engage, let's talk about childcare services. Let's talk about the state of water quality in your town. Let's talk about, again, the prison industrial complex. Let's talk about any number of issues that are all part of reproductive justice. It's broader, intersectional. It's a web of things that all contribute. I find the specificity really of talking about abortion but the specificity of one church's social statement on abortion, which is so narrow, actually the narrowness of it shows how broad of an issue it actually is. So there's two things I want to kind of conclude with here today, and then open up for hopefully some conversation, questions. I invite you to use the chat. Candace is going to be on top of that. Because when I get to the end of when I was sort of working on this book, and you get into these conversations, you kind of like, okay, so what do we do, right? This is also a very Lutheranish question, right? What then shall we do, right? When I was first thinking about this, I realized that, when I pose the question of what do I really want folks to take away from this? What do I think I really want people to hear? And I thought, well, it just really depends on who you are. Okay. So there's a contextual thing going on there. So what I ended up doing is I identified for myself 5 different sort of people that I think somebody reading and engaging this statement and thinking about it from the position of faith and faith commitments, they're going to need to hear different things, right? So I wrote these little, and then I was like, then I turned into, this is meant to be a really it's the tiniest book ever. It's like literally this big, meant to be accessible for folks. So I said, let's make it even more accessible, and let me write a letter, tiny little letter. Dear pregnant Lutheran, dear voting Lutheran, neighbor Lutheran, roster Lutheran church, okay? So I leaned into the epistolary form for this. And given the audience and the context, I think I'm going to read for you, just so you get a sample of what this looks like, the letter, Dear Rostered Lutheran. Because this isn't a fascinating political moment for this church, in terms of the fact now that abortion laws are different in different states and different contexts. The fact that I am not a rostered person, but my friends who are clergy, who are synod staff, who are bishops, confront very different challenges depending on where they are. If you're in Iowa or if you're in Minnesota, it looks different. So here's what I wrote for the Dear Rostered Lutheran. You are called to accompany people, and you are trusted to walk alongside of them in life and in faith. You may be asked direct questions. You may be asked to simply sit beside. You may be asked about a decision that would violate current state law. You may be aware of actions that do likewise. You are taking holy risks, sacred steps to care for those whose well-being is entrusted to you. You are a leader in a church that faithfully recognizes the complex ground and shifting winds around you. So what matters most? The pregnant person before you, the woman beside you, the family seeking your presence. Listen to them, listen for them, and carry the gospel of God's love into their hearts, regardless. So that's a sample of sort of a letter. I then have like little, here's what the social statement says that I'm drawing on, and a little kind of explanation of it, because there's a lot in there, right? But for me, it was really important because this is one of these widely political, very public issues that is so deeply personal at the same time, right? And so that's why it was important for me in talking about this stuff to get really personal in the kind of communication points. Here are the last things I want to leave you with before opening it up for some reflection, conversation, questions. 5 things I want you to take away from any conversation about Lutheran social teaching on abortion. The ELCA trusts women. As I said before, I really wish I didn't have to say this out loud. I really wish this wasn't countercultural or radical or whatever it is today. But the ELCA trusts women, and that is substantial. The fact that Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, a Lutheran, really helped make part of the last presidential campaign the claim that we Democratic Party trusts women, right? That wasn't an accident, right? Legal and safe abortion is part of care for pregnant people. This church is very clear on that. It's not the only part of it, but it is a part of it. It's also very clear that law and public policy are moving in the wrong direction and continues to do so by the day. Reproductive justice requires many, many kinds of social and political engagement, different people, different places, different times. The needs change based on who you are. It can be very overwhelming. Lots of activists and advocates are reminding us today to focus, right? Focus, don't let the overwhelm is the strategy. It's the point. Find something you can hang on to and engage. Lastly, hope is hard. Especially now. I gave a talk on this book at a church in Decorah, Iowa, a Sunday after the election. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. There was a standing room only crowd in this fireside room of this beautiful church in Decorah. And I carried with me for about a week and a half a pain in my yellow chakra, my solar plexus. And it was really hard with that group to talk about hope because we didn't have any at that point. And there were women, older women, tears in there. Like, we've done this before. And a woman who said, I was a nurse in Texas in the 60s before Roe. I've been there. I've done this before. I'm like, I don't know. But hope is hard. I do have some more articulate ways of talking about hope in my kind of written reflections on this. But I'll leave you with a benediction and then get out of the sharing. The Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice has so many great resources on this work at the intersection of faith and reproductive justice. My subtitle for this particular book is called To Compassionate Community, because I think that's the bottom line bedrock thing about Lutheran social teaching is we are called to compassionate community. And so I offer you this benediction, having received compassion and understanding from those who have cared for you, may they become gifts in your hands, waiting for someone else who needs them. Thank you all very much. I look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Riswold, for this tour de force of theology and culture and history, the things that we are, or I am so often trying to convey to my students that this is the work that they are doing when they are going into ministry. So we have a couple of questions here in the chat from Marvis, and I'm going to invite those of you who have other questions to please go ahead and put those in the chat, and we will start this off. So the first question here that we have is, what has the ELCA's response been in the past years to the kind of legal violations of these mandates that in the social statement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right after the Dobbs decision, Bishop Eden did put out a pastoral message, lifting up the social statement and saying, this is the church teaching. And so I think at that kind of highest level, there has been public attention to our church teaches otherwise. And so there's that. At the kind of level of scholarly and political engagement, the ELCA advocacy team has been kind of tracking things. This is it's been kind of like whack-a-mole in terms of issues that pop up in different states. So a lot of statewide organizing has been necessary. In Iowa, for example, just a couple weeks, maybe a month ago now, there was a tremendous amount of engagement around Lutheran Day on the Hill, right? Many state capitals and state legislatures have designated lobbying days throughout the year. There were busloads of Lutherans, and also Lutherans had been thrown under the bus by the governor of Iowa at that point. So there's nothing like, in calling us a crime syndicate to motivate us to get involved. So there's been some statewide stuff that's been more important than ever because we are now back to a pre-Roe landscape, right? So that the challenges for my neighbors in Minnesota, 90 miles north, is very different than they are for here, for where I live. So statewide and local organizing has become more important among Lutherans. And I've started to see that. There also was an issue of the Journal of Lutheran Ethics that was, again, in a post-Dobbs, sort of gathering many voices together saying, what do we do, right? In that, I kind of reflected. For me, it was a very quick piece, and a lot of turnaround on that. But I leaned into sort of a generational perspective and said, so I was born like 18 months before Roe, right? So I was born in 71. And then when Dobbs was decided in 2022, I was 51. So that means the entirety of my reproductive life, and this is true for this kind of micro generation of women, the entirety of my reproductive life was protected. That is no longer the case, right? For the young people in my classroom, for the family members, for the beloved young people in my life, the way that they need to make decisions now is very different. And so just kind of reflecting on that. So I give you those examples of sort of presiding bishop pastoral message, statewide Lutherans organizing themselves and doing what they can do based on what's happening in their state, scholars and activists writing, telling stories, and so on. If you feel like there has not been enough, sometimes, where have the Lutherans been after Dobbs? I will say, where have you been? Right? If you are among the Lutherans, what are the things you've been doing? And I know many people in this room have been doing the work, right? But if insofar as you take this conversation out to your communities, and I please hope that you do, you are the ones, right? You're the leaders. And so I think this is where we lean into each other. And just to me, this reminding that Living Lutheran is now doing it. There's the Deeper Understanding series this whole year is on the social statements, lifting them up. So hopefully that gets a little bit. Thank you for that question, Marvis.
I'm going to throw in a question of my own here, and see how it might take the conversation in a variety of ways. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the theological foundations for these types of social responses and social actions. I'm particularly thinking about the two kingdoms doctrine and the three estates, and the ways that Lutherans can understand themselves to have agency for this type of response.
Yeah. I think you just answered your question, Candace. We have agency, right? We are citizens in this world. The theological foundation, to me, it can be, it can also be more, but it can be as simple as the love of the neighbor, right? Neighbor justice. It is as simple and straightforward as that at some level. I do, obviously, through the two kingdoms stuff, right? Luther was not advocating that we all just focus on the hereafter and the life beyond. That theology is only about me and God. No, it's how are you caring for the person next to you, your neighbor. One of the letters I wrote in the book is Dear Neighbor Lutheran, and I really had, for each of them, I had a really specific person in mind. That's the best way to do the epistolary form. But what is the role of neighbor, right? So all of the theological foundation behind neighborness and how we relate to each other, to me, is also essential in this work. The one other thing you mentioned, there's lots of things about Luther's works that are unhelpful in lots of things, but there are things that are surprisingly helpful. So one of the texts that I teach with students when we're doing Luther is his the Consolation for Women Whose Pregnancies Have Not Gone Well. So it's a pastoral letter, right, that he wrote, and I think it's a marvelous example not only of Luther's pastoral voice. So I think there's a whole theological foundation in Lutheranism of what it means to be a pastor, what it means to be a clergy person, whatever language you would like to use. And when Luther was writing about this, maybe it's there, and even translations of that piece have differed over time. Used to only be called women who've had miscarriages. Now the recent translations are women whose pregnancies have not gone well. But what's fascinating in the piece, and he wrote it, of course, in the 16th century, but for him, the central theological issue was families being concerned about, is this baby going to go to heaven? Right. So if a pregnancy has not gone well, or a baby dies shortly after birth and hasn't been baptized, oh my God, Luther's direct message in that context is that it always comes back to grace, and it's up to God, and that God accepts the mother's prayer, right? So there's something really specific about baptismal theology in that he's trying to open up. But for me, the message is grace, period, right? Regardless of the situation, that God's grace is bigger than any of the categories that we have put on it. And I think that is a theological foundation for thinking about this work as well. So, yeah. I said you answered it, and then I said 14 things, but yeah.
Yeah, I love that for women whose pregnancies have not gone well. I think that really showcases a different side of Luther that is very pastoral, and always kind of deferring to what is the pastoral response here beyond our ideologies, right?
Yep.
Thank you. So we have a question here that I believe is one related to how could we evolve the statement for today. The person has asked, my question is related to the exploitation of women's bodies, which of course can and does involve pregnancy and unborn life. However, there is also the absence or lack of ability to bear children, and the ways in which women are valued or devalued for their purpose and vocation in life based on their reproductivity. The social statement of sexuality, gift, and trust, and perhaps that of persons living with disabilities, can address this. But is there a way that this social statement could include a small sentence that addresses this issue?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, because I think opening up these experiences has to be part of the conversation, right? So I would say two things. One, kind of briefly and really strategically and practically, there are processes for revisiting social statements. Those of you paying attention to the gift and trust work right now are seeing what that looks like. So there are processes to do that. If I'm going to be really honest with you, I don't think we should or need to do that with the abortion social statement. Let me say a couple of reasons why. First of all, drawing on the 2019, the most recent social statement on faith, sexism, and justice, I think gets to some of the very experiences that the question asks about. Broader considerations around the exploitation of women's bodies, broader experience around commodification, of the experiences of sexism in patriarchal church and culture. So I think we actually have this broader statement now that we can draw on: faith, sexism, and justice, that get at that and so many other issues, right? And so I think because there is that resource, and then if I can be really honest and blunt strategically, when I look at the social statement, even though, and I do have some critiques about some language that's used, the construct of marriage is outdated. It's very binary. It doesn't account for trans people and non-binary people becoming pregnant. There's lots of ways, and it's not perfect in that way. But in that way, it's a product of its time. So that's why I kind of wanted to bring 1991 back to our memory. Frankly, I don't know that an abortion social statement would pass this church today. I'm just gonna say that in terms of the political conversations today, that the laws look very different today. And so I actually think that we have a pretty good gift in a 1990 and a 4-year-old statement now. We have a pretty good gift that some of it sounds like it could have been written last week, right? And so there's something really kind of blunt in this is just my personal opinion, I could be completely wrong, would love to be wrong, in terms of what consensus building looks like today. And I think it looks a lot harder. So this is why I'm all in on kind of leaning into what we have and connecting the updating language where we need to. This is all true. I mean, I think that similarly to, when I teach students about how to read the Bible, right? We talk about the context in which it was written, but even though the context is radically different, and some of these things we know either are not true or are problematic or whatever, does that mean we update the Bible? Wait, I'm not saying social statements are the Bible. Please don't hear that, right? But that same kind of how we engage with texts, I think, is going on here. So that's kind of a lot of different ways of answering the we can use the statement, we can draw on what's helpful, and then we can also lean into other teaching statements and whatnot that are coming from the church today. Yeah.
Thank you. That's kind of a chilling response, but an honest one.
It's just me.
To that, related to that, Greg Kaufman has written, and I'm going to try my best to turn this into a question, but it's a statement that perhaps you just want to respond to.
Sure.
Your reminder of intersectionality got me thinking. I noticed in the participant list the lack of persons like me. What does that say about our church when those who identify as male, for the most part, didn't fit this into their schedules?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of work, I'm going to turn this into a question. What kind of work needs to be done in the ELCA for those identifying as male to prioritize these types of issues?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If I had the answer to that, I'd make $1,000 million. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's important to notice that. And I do think it's important to name the who's in the room and who's not in the room. And if you don't see folks like you in this room, I encourage you to have those conversations with those folks. Right. Questions around engaging men in the women's movement and feminist activism is as old as feminism and the women's movement. This is just the newest iteration of it. Right. I think what's interesting, and I think we've seen this in on a lot of different issues, folks get involved in things when and make time for it, prioritize it in their schedule, as you said, Greg. When they realize it matters to them, when they realize it does actually affect their lives. I think that because we live in a patriarchal culture, men have the illusion, or afforded the illusion, that issues around gender, sexuality, abortion, and women's bodies aren't immediately relevant to them, inevitably, until it does, until it is your girlfriend, spouse, wife, daughter, whatever. Do I wish that it didn't take that? Absolutely, I do. I wish that it just automatically mattered. I do think there are some generational shifts in that conversation. And, again, I've been working with 20-year-olds for 25 years. This is my 25th year of teaching undergraduate students. And I do think there's been some shift over time. I will say that. But this is why, again, since I'm talking so much about politics, go back to the Harris Walz campaign. And one of the online affinity groups that emerged was White Dudes for Harris, right? And there was so many fascinating conversations, and it was celebrities, it was ordinary people, it was fascinating to watch if you were paying attention to those. Maybe some of you joined the White Dudes for Harris group. But it was so fun to watch the men do their work, right? It was just as somebody who gets to sit and watch young people do their work at various points in time, to see, 50-year-old men being like, we actually need to step up and yes, thank you. Welcome to the party, right? Or the welcome to the work. I guess I should say. So, and that kind of thinking around allies, accomplices, and whatever can apply in so many different areas. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to go in lieu of new questions coming in, which is an invitation for the folks. We're going to wrap up soon. So if you have any final questions, please do give us those. In the meantime, I want to go back to a question that Marvis posed earlier, which is that these unjust laws impact women of color, different classes of women, and different age groups differently. So how do we bring them all together in a theological response?
I think, so this is to me why the framing of reproductive justice is really important to this, because it is built on the fancy language of intersectional analysis, but the millennia of the work of women of color who have always understood that race, age, ability, social class are all factors, right? Some of us were not raised having to think about all of those things. I include myself in that, right? And have to learn to think about them, right? And so I think that lifting up that framework, because it can and it does sort of bring together all of the experiences at the intersection. And it highlights the fact that when you're talking about something as specific as abortion politics, one of the things that it affects people's life differently. That has been the case for as long as it has existed. Even in the, if you know the history of the development, for example, of the oral contraceptive pill in this country, there are some horrific stories about beta testing that was done on women in Puerto Rico, because these were women who were poor, didn't have a voice, couldn't advocate for themselves. There are still to this day horrific stories of women in prison who are more likely to be poor and women of color, forced to give birth in shackles. That's part of reproductive justice. And so I think that using language that holds all of that is important, because in the years leading up to the Dobbs decision, really starting in the 80s with the Hyde stuff, and then Webster and Case, all of the laws that over time you had Roe, and then it kind of chipped away at access. People who look like me, who are hetero-married, insured, employed women, I could always be assured that if I needed an abortion, I could find it. I could get access to it, right? If I need fertility treatments, I could find it, I could access it. I have the resources, socially, financially, and structurally. That's not the case for all women. It never has been the case for all women. And so I think those realities were already in place. I think the Dobbs decision now has simply just made it more obvious who is harmed. Because frankly, women who have means and who have white privilege and employment privilege and passport privilege will always be able to find the care that they need. And that's not fair. That's not just. That is not what social justice looks like. And I think that naming that, if people don't understand that, is important. And then that's why the one part that I included, I think, in the list of sort of statements is that the lifting up the coerced sterilization and abortion, that, as recently as the 80s, and I suspect we're going to come back to it again, to make sterilization a condition of receiving public benefits. Okay. There are people who advocate for that, and I frankly would not be surprised to see that coming back again. The way that Native women's experiences have been around forced sterilization. And again, beta testing of unsafe medical devices, medicines, and so on. And so, I taught women's history and women's studies for many years. And there's always a unit, right, on health and healthcare and disparities. And so paying attention to that is part of this work. So that's why, to me, the capaciousness of intersectionality as a theory and the way that both Lutheran and feminist share some of those features of a broad way of thinking leads directly into reproductive justice theologically and politically today. Thank you for that question, Marvis. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think that that's a great place for us to conclude. And I'm going to invite everyone to give Dr. Riswold a silent applause here on our call, our Zoom call.
We love it.
And I will turn this back over to Marvis and Dean Thomas for the presentation of the scholarships. Thank you again, Dr. Riswold. This was really wonderful.
Thank you so much, Candace. I appreciate your work.
Thank you so much. This was an awesome presentation. I loved it. I had so many questions. I was like, wow, I want to continue this discussion. This is great. You were really good. Thank you so much for coming out. But our program's not over. As I mentioned, we have some exciting news. And so LSTC's Vice President and Dean of Academic Affairs, Dr. Linda Thomas, will make the announcement.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Riswold, fantastic. Thank you so much. Glad to see you here, having known you across the years. But the announcement is that we have a new scholarship called the Olson Scholarship for Lutheran Women. And I'm going to tell you about it, and I hope that the donor is here. I'm not sure. Yes, great. We want to take a moment to thank the Reverend Margie Olson, whose generosity and vision enable our Women's History Month programming. Reverend Olson, are you here? Could you identify? Okay. I can't see everyone.
She's on her phone. I think she probably, well, she's on the phone. I can see her here, but her photo's not available. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, and anyhow, I got to do this. We finish. My next appointment is here. In 2023, she established a fund at LSTC to support activities inspired by feminist theology and the leadership and ministry of women in the Lutheran tradition. In 1995, after raising a family and building a successful nursing career, Reverend Olson graduated from LSTC with a Master's of Divinity degree. Although she was approaching what many would consider retirement age, Reverend Olson worked another decade in parish ministry before finally retiring. Nevertheless, her experiences in seminary and the liberation she found in feminist theologians inspired her to help other women in their spiritual journeys. In 2024, Reverend Olson's donations funded a women's panel and reception during Women's History Month. Her contributions have supported this inspirational two-day series for the last 2 days this year. However, Ms. Olson wanted to ensure that female students directly benefited from her donation. To that end, we have added a scholarship component for Lutheran women studying at LSTC and named it the Olson Scholarship for Lutheran Women at LSTC in honor of Reverend Margie Olson, LSTC class of 1995. The scholarship criteria include completing at least 1 year of study at LSTC, financial need, and a desire to work in church leadership and ministry. It consists of 3 awards. It's going to be 4 awards this year of approximately $500 each, given to 4 female students studying at LSTC. 4 recipients have demonstrated outstanding capacity for ministry and leadership in their fields of study. They have fulfilled all criteria, and we are excited to announce their names. So the recipients of the 2025 Olson Scholarship for Lutheran Women are Jebu, Char Laiwa, Denise Rector, and Hannah Peterson. Please join me in celebrating these 4 women and honoring the dedication of our donor, the Reverend Margie Olson. Again, class of 1995. So I turn it back over to Marvis.
Okay, thank you so much. That is awesome. Let's give a round of applause for our donor, Reverend Margie Olson, and our winners. Thank you so much. We are so glad you're able to join us today. This concludes our program.